Welcome to the inaugural episode of the Center for the Study of the Holocaust and Genocide at Sonoma State University's podcast. Today, we turn to the summer of 1941, a pivotal and volatile moment in Holocaust history. When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, the collapse of Soviet authority across Eastern Europe created a sudden and dangerous power vacuum. In at least 219 towns and villages, pogroms erupted. In a matter of weeks, an estimated 13 to 35,000 Jews were killed, often not in camps, but in their own communities. So, how should we understand this violence? Was it spontaneous? Was it orchestrated? Or does the answer lie in the complex interaction between German invasion, local grievances, ideology, and opportunity? Joining us today is Dr. Jared McBride, whose research into these pogroms, particularly in Western Ukraine and the town of Tuchin, challenges simplified narratives and forces us to examine how ordinary people became perpetrators during one of the most consequential summers of the 20th century. So let me welcome you to our podcast, Professor McBride. Could you just maybe introduce yourself and a brief introduction to your research?
Sure. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. I enjoyed giving the lecture at Sonoma State, what I believe is maybe 2 weeks ago now. So I'm an assistant professor of history at UCLA. My focus is primarily on Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union in the 20th century. My initial project, which I'm currently finishing up a manuscript, is on the Second World War in Western Ukraine, in particular the region of Volhynia, where Tuchin is located, and looking at local perpetrators and different layers of violence during the Nazi occupation. I have a general interest in interethnic violence, war crimes trials, and just general questions about common or everyday people and their participation in political violence.
Thank you for that. And I have watched your lecture, and I highly recommend it to all of our listeners as well. We'll be linking to that. So to begin, could you briefly situate us in summer 1941? What changed in Eastern Europe with the launch of Operation Barbarossa, and why is that so pivotal?
Sure. So this is a tumultuous time for many reasons. And given I've obviously laid this out in the lecture as well to the students and others who are present, that if we're going to understand the violence of 1941, we had a bare minimum need to go back at least 2, 3 years, and preferably perhaps a couple decades. So the region that I'm focusing on, and I'll kind of maybe situate my comments here a little bit more geographically on my region of Western Ukraine, prior to the summer of 1941, had been under occupation by the Soviet Union for the better part of 21 months. And this is because on early September 1939, when the Second World War started, which most listeners, students, and others will be familiar with, Nazi Germany launches an invasion against Poland, the Second Republic of Poland, on September 1st, 1939. What accompanies this invasion of Poland is a Soviet invasion from the east. Now, some people know about the Soviet occupation prior at the same time and prior to 1944, 1945, but it's often, I think, confused or lost in the confusion of fall of 1939. The Soviets were able to move into this borderland region, which kind of reaches from the Baltic Sea and the three Baltic states all the way down to the Black Sea. This borderland strip, they were able to move into this region because they had signed an agreement with Nazi Germany called the Non-Aggression Pact. This was, at least on its surface, as it's named or deemed, a sort of joint pact in which these two powers will not attack each other during this particular time. There's also some sort of economic agreements built into this pact. But what is not officially stated or the public is not told about is that there are secret protocols to this pact that allow the Soviet Union to occupy this borderland region. And this borderland region is mostly made up of territories that had previously been a part of the Imperial Russian Empire, and that the Soviets were forced to give up in 1922, given the results of the Civil War and various kind of overlapping wars in this region. So these were territories that the Soviets that are include Baltic peoples, but as well as some Slavic peoples, including Ukrainians and other groups. The Soviets had wanted these territories to take them over as a buffer against any future war or potential attack, ironically enough, from the Nazis, who they just signed this non-aggression pact with. So the Soviets are going to come into this region and brutally suppress local populations. They're obviously going to elevate some groups within these societies, but there's going to be a brutal amount of oppression. Tens of thousands of people will be shot. Often on the spot and in many of the prisons and towns and cities in this region. Hundreds of thousands of people will be deported to Siberia and the Far East into the Gulag system, and an authoritarian regime will be instituted in these borderland areas. And so this is going to kind of set the groundwork for what happens in June of 1941, which is the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. So once the Nazis have subdued most of the European continent, they're now going to tear up this non-aggression pact and focus their attention on bringing down what ultimately was always their number one enemy, which was the Soviets. And so they're going to, at this time, it's two bordering countries or nations. Nazi Germany abuts the Soviet Union at this time as a result of the non-aggression pact. And then on early in the morning of June 22nd, 1941, the Nazis are going to send millions of German soldiers as well as other Axis soldiers into the Soviet Union, which they'll immediately create a power vacuum. Maybe I'll leave it there for now.
So, for viewers who may not be familiar with the term, how do you define a pogrom, and how are the events of the summer of 1941 perhaps distinct from earlier waves of anti-Jewish violence?
Right. So this word pogrom, and I don't know, can't remember how much background I gave in the lecture, but which there's a very interesting terminological history of this word. So this word comes from Russian. It's born out of a wave of pogrom violence in the 1880s and 1890s in the Imperial Russian Empire. It's a loan word, which effectively means storm or thunder. It gets brought into English and is really picked up, I believe, from about 1892 or so onward. It has common usage in the English language. Now, there's no one particular definition of the word pogrom. There's actually a lot of interesting scholarly debate about its usage, both historically as well as in kind of contemporary situations and how applicable it is. But generally, a kind of general accepted terminology or definition is somewhere along the lines of acts of violence against a Jewish community, typically or almost always by non-Jewish actors, typically locals from within these communities where the Jewish population lives. There's an intent to loot or destroy Jewish property, but not always, and as well as an intent to physically harm and sometimes kill Jews in these particular areas. And depending upon the situation and the dynamics, you'll see one or two of those aspects of the violence. And sometimes there's an intent to dispel communities. So that's kind of that would be sort of a core definition of what we understand to be a pogrom. But larger kind of questions loom around this definition about the role of the state, in particular, how spontaneous this violence is versus how planned it is, as well as several other issues. And some colleagues prefer to not use pogrom at all, instead of kind of opted for a more general term like anti-Jewish violence. But it's in some ways a hard word to give up, given its magnitude, and kind of, I would say, just kind of larger resonance as a term. It evokes a certain it evokes a certain feeling in listeners and readers, which is kind of helpful in situating the violence that you're about to read about or or look into historically. And I'll add on just this waves aspect there. I mean, depending upon how you want to historicize this word pogrom, some people want to go back to the Romans, and 2000 years. But in the kind of modern era, right, there are various waves of pogroms, the majority of which are in the Russian Empire, and take place in various localities where Jews live. So it's typically in what is called the Pale of the Settlement, which is these western borderlands of the Imperial Russian Empire. And within the context of the Second World War, where we see this violence in the summer of 1941, the most previous wave of pogroms was during the previous World War, which also affected this region and this borderland region. So there are even mini waves. There are probably about three mini waves of pogroms during this kind of cauldron of conflict from 1914, the beginning of World War One, through the end of the civil wars in Eastern Europe in 1922. So this is for both the victims and the participants and the bystanders in summer of 41. This is something that if you're 40 years or older, you probably remember similar such violence occurring within your own lifetime. And then, of course, the people who experienced this in World War One would also have memories of this violence from 1905 and from the 1880s and so on and so forth. So it really has a kind of a connective tissue in a kind of historical resonance of this violence for people living in this region.
And your work seems to challenge the binary framing of these pogroms as either spontaneous mob violence or entirely German orchestrated. I'm curious how that debate developed in Holocaust historiography, and where does your work intervene in that?
Sure. So there's a kind of longer historiographical debate that has been going on pretty much since the war ended. And I also did this in the lecture, and I'll kind of do this here. Maybe I will add a few more details here. The important thing to understand is about when it comes to early Holocaust studies, a lot of this work was either being done by North American or Western European scholars who tended to be German specialists and who tended to focus on German documentation. Famously or infamously, the Nazis were very good at keeping records, not just about day-to-day matters in the Third Reich, but also about the violence that they carried out against their own citizens and people around the continent. And so a lot of these early histories that, and sometimes solely focused on the Holocaust or focused on both on the kind of a history of the Third Reich and its violence and genocides, would get a particular view of this stage of violence during the war. And, there's much larger debates about when and how the Holocaust begins. Most students of history will have heard about this functionalist and intentionalist debate. And that's, we won't get into that now. But this kind of question and this still this kind of gray area of how and when the Holocaust, or how and when there's a decision made to try to kill all of European Jewry. And it's really a transition period in the summer of 1941. And partly for that reason, there had been previously perhaps an over focus or perhaps a real kind of preference for putting the Germans at the center of this history, and for good reason, right? There's no genocide of European Jewry without the Germans. This was a German project from the beginning until the end, just a project that was carried out often with the help of a lot of local populations. So for this reason, German documents privilege a German view of violence. So where there was what looked like or could have been conceived as spontaneous violence, which you get glimpses of in German documentation, a lot of early authors and often wonderful historians writing on, using this documentation, writing these histories, would tend to frame this violence as German orchestrated, even if there were locals involved. And the idea here, we use this word agency a lot as historians. The idea here is that agency always was held by the Germans and not by locals. So even if locals were involved in harming local Jewish populations, that occurred because the Germans forced them to do this or enticed them, right? And so this kind of long shadow of the German historiography really presided until I want to say the 1990s. And at this point, when archives are opened, and sometimes and I've stressed this in the talk maybe briefly, but not just new archival material from Eastern Europe, but sometimes actually just returning to archives that had actually been existed for decades, but people hadn't paid enough attention to them. And this is often archives that contain Jewish testimonies about what occurred to them during the war. So there's it's kind of two movements at once that happen around the 90s and into the 2000s, where historians, not ignoring German documentation, we have a pretty good picture of how Germans made decisions, what their relationship was to spontaneous violence. And the short answer is they didn't love it, and they found it to be ineffective to their larger goals, right, which were genocidal. When people looked at Jewish voices and Jewish testimony, and also looked at testimony from other locals and other people in this region, really began to uncover that there was really a lot beneath the surface here. You could kind of use the metaphor of of a glacier, which is kind of peeking out from the surface of the water, which is what you're looking at. The kind of ice that's above the water is what you're looking at when you look at German documentation, and then beneath the surface is this enormous glacier. And that's really been the case when it comes to this pogrom violence, is beginning to understand that and I could just say it's not one thing or the another, which is how you frame this question. It wasn't, oh, the Germans weren't involved or the Germans had nothing to do with this was all locals. But it actually turns out that depending on the location you're looking at, the particular event, the violent event you're looking at, and sometimes even multiple events within one location, there's sometimes the Germans and locals are present, who seem to be working with one another. Sometimes the locals appear to be taking a lead, and that Germans happen to be there. And really, I should say, in the last 10 or 15 years, there's been an even higher emphasis on the fact that we have found pogroms where there's no Germans at all, right? And this is something that could not even have been, or maybe, which just was not conceptualized. And if you were reading Holocaust books from the 70s and 80s, this idea that locals had initiated what were vicious pogrom-like activity in the summer of 41, and there wasn't a German in sight. And so how to make sense of all of this and how to put all this in conversation with one another, that has been the task of the last couple decades.
Your work focuses closely on the town of Tuchin. What made it a revealing case study for understanding local participation?
So this question of why Tuchin, right? And so in some situations, I mean, obviously, like a hard scientist, if we were setting up an experiment, we would love to have as much data as possible to look into a particular problem and try to work through this problem and come up with a solution. In history, it can be a little, we work from both directions. Sometimes we have something we want to look into and we can't find anything, and sometimes we come across things just accidentally when we do archival research. What makes Tuchin attractive from simply just a source basis is that there is a lot of testimony about this particular event. There's a wave of pogroms across this region, less so Estonia and Latvia, more so parts of Belarus, parts of Eastern Poland, parts of Western Ukraine, and parts of Bukovina. So there's places where there's more or less pogroms. The fact that we know of a pogrom, right, does not mean that we have a lot of information about the pogrom, and does not mean we have a lot of information about the perpetrators of this violence, right? Or the victims, I should say. So we kind of have a general sense of the broad topographical layout of where pogrom violence has. But then if we want to do what I'm interested in doing, which is ask questions, really kind of micro level questions about participation, that's going to be wholly dependent upon what sources kind of bequeath to us, right? It's not by design. And so Tuchin is one of these hundreds of pogroms, right? It's on a list of pogroms, but unlike even other pogroms that happen sometimes within 5-10 miles from Tuchin. And I had kind of, for earlier work, had isolated all the pogrom violence in my one kind of sub-region. Unlike some of these other events of pogroms where I might have 2-3 testimonies from one source or one archive, or I might have 5 or 6, right? For Tuchin, I have an immense amount of testimony that stretches from really almost before the war ends, so 1944 up into I want to say 2012 or 15, something like this. So someone, a bystander, had given a testimony basically a decade ago, right? So it's testimony that stretches across time, which is helpful in terms of validating and understanding and kind of testing the reliability of the information, and from a range of people. And this is really what kind of drew me most into Tuchin versus some of the other pogrom violence that I've looked at, is there's a wealth of Jewish testimony from multiple sources. There's testimony of bystanders, so people who, there's a lot of questions about this term bystanders, but people who are present and not involved in the violence, to our knowledge. And there's also testimony from perpetrators, right? And I can't give I can't give an estimate, but I'd be willing to bet of, the 200 plus pogroms in this region, how many of them that we have perpetrator testimony from, I would say is probably absolutely minute, because typically perpetrators do not leave long worded accounts of the violence that they enact, especially against innocent people. And what is more confounding about, and this is perhaps a nice moment to inject this into this conversation, what's particularly confounding about studying pogrom violence in the summer of 1941, and pretty much any historian who decides that they're interested in this are going to find this out right away, um, is that you're not going to find a lot of people who were involved in this violence who are alive by 1944, 1945, because it's a wave of violence that kills, something like 20 to 30,000 Jews across this entire region. That's an enormous amount of people, and deserves, deserves hundreds of books in its own right. But it precedes, well, one of the worst genocides in human history. And so the idea that you're going to find someone who managed to not only survive the summer of 1941, but then a genocide against European Jewry, is difficult. And then I should also say, and this is, when you're interested in questions of perpetration, this idea that perpetrators will also just be around after the war as well is really difficult to work out, because a lot of the people who are involved in this violence, in terms of locals, will be subject to a brutal Nazi occupation, could be killed by the Nazis. A lot of them join insurgency movements in this region, so many of them are probably killed fighting the Soviets during an underground battles. Some of them might die in other reasons after the war. Some of them might be arrested by the Soviets, so on and so forth. So it's just really difficult to get multiple views of a singular event. And in the case of Tuchin, right, we're talking, well, I'm sure we'll get into this. We're getting into one night. And so to get, and I'm able to do this very fortunately on my part, to get a panoramic view of a particular night, or really matter of hours of violence across what is 4 to 5 years of extreme violence in a violent region, is really hard to do. And so that kind of explains what drew me into Tuchin. I will also add, on the source base, and maybe we'll come to this too. I mean, I was able to even meet one of the survivors of this violence. So this is a story about Laura Oberlander, whose last name was Hamut, or rendered as Emmett in English, who had given testimony to the USC Shoah Foundation. And I was able to meet her where I was writing my dissertation research. And, historians are obviously people too. And so when we even, when the ability to actually talk to people involved in these events, the ability to visit these spaces, obviously I think it adds an emotional dimension to doing this kind of research. And so that was really important.
I think in your talk, you described the German invasion as creating a power vacuum. And how quickly did that collapse of authority translate into this type of violence? And then what does that really tell us about the fragility of social order?
So in a lot of places, the advance is very quick, right? The Soviets, for a number of reasons, which people may or may not be aware of in terms of the command structure in the Soviet government, in preparation for the invasion, the Soviet front collapses extremely quickly. Germans able to make a lot of progress, sometimes within days. They're first moving through Western Ukraine, right? And so a lot of these areas, we see the Soviets pull out sometimes within 24 to 48, sometimes 72 hours, but at least by the end of that first or second week, the Soviets are definitely gone. And so what is going to happen in a lot of places, and we see this in Tuchin, is there's typically going to be kind of a wave of looting at first, and in places where there's a strong kind of Jewish presence within a town or city sometimes. We will see often peasants or more rural populations come in from the countryside to loot Jewish neighborhoods and businesses, which tend to be located within these locations. Sometimes this looting is accompanied by violence. Obviously, there's probably a larger question or debate here about how to kind of frame or understand that violence. But within Tuchin, we see this when the Germans kind of pass through briefly, and this is what's important to keep in mind about the fluidity of at least these first 2 weeks. The Germans often stop in. The Germans might kind of initiate, some small acts of violence against Jews or seek to humiliate Jews or sometimes set synagogues on fire or set Torah scrolls on fire. But then they keep moving, right? The Germans are fighting a war. They need to continue fighting the Red Army. So there's often kind of a passing through phase. And what we see in Tuchin is that the Germans have passed through. There has been some looting. There has been kind of small acts of violence, nothing fatal at this point, in which both Ukrainians and Poles, to our understanding, have taken advantage of the Jewish population and kind of looted Jewish businesses and stores and some homes. But we will then see individuals who are connected to some of whom are connected to a larger Ukrainian nationalist movement. And this has been a movement that had existed for decades up until this point. It grown mostly out of Galicia. This is a group of people, often referred to as the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, whose primary goal was to create an independent Ukrainian state, right? And bring together all Ukrainian territories under this state, a sovereign state that was not ruled by the Russians, not ruled by the Poles, and not ruled by the Germans. And so people connected to this organization, some of whom thought that it was, the best practice in this power vacuum was to establish power, right? And this was to get rid of obviously communists. This was to get rid of other nationalities who weren't necessarily supposed to be a part of this project, or they were supposed to play a lesser role. And this meant seizing the reins of not only the federal government, or the kind of the head government in Lviv, as well as in cities, as well as even in towns. So there's a real urgency in planning to taking over locations and establishing Ukrainian power on the ground, right? And in the case of Tuchin, we're going to see several people who are connected to this Ukrainian nationalist movement involved in this, as well as other people. So there's other people who, to my knowledge, are not involved in Ukrainian nationalist movement. People of an older generation typically are going to be put into positions of power in a kind of self-declared local government. And then you're going to have a militia that will be set up or controlled or at least connected in some way to this Ukrainian nationalist movement. And so in Tuchin, we're going to see the establishment of a militia, at least with some connection to this OUN, and we're going to see a local government put together by quote unquote Ukrainian patriots or people who are sympathetic to this Ukrainian nationalist movement. And so that's the kind of very tenuous power status or power dynamics that we see on the eve of the violence that happens in Tuchin.
I'm curious, how might we understand the summer 1941 pogroms in relation to the later mass shootings carried out by the Einsatzgruppen? So were
Mhm.
these pogroms a precursor, a testing ground, or something distinct?
So in some instances, right, where we see German involvement, right, the Germans are interested in this initial wave of violence. The Germans are interested in um, carrying out killings of local Jewish leadership and people they believe connected to the communist regime, right? I mean, this is often kind of portrayed as one and the same, because it's under this rubric of Judeo-Bolshevism, right, where all Jews are communists and all communists are Jews. So the Germans are given explicit instructions to carry out limited shootings of typically Jewish men and males, as well as people connected to the Communist Party. And again, sometimes equated, even if there's not an equation there, in the summer of 1941. So some of this violence that we see in terms of pogroms is often right before these limited shootings that happen throughout July and into August. And we see German SS units present, as and sometimes Wehrmacht as well, who will carry out these killings, but they require local participation, right? And this is this kind of conjuncture of where we have local power dynamics meeting a larger kind of imperialist genocidal campaign. If the Germans roll into a small town like Tuchin, they are not necessarily going to know who was in charge under the Soviet regime. They're not necessarily going to know where all the Jews live in a particular town, and they're not necessarily at first blush, right, going to necessarily know who is Jewish and who isn't. And so, in a lot of these places, they rely heavily upon these newly constructed local militias and self-anointed local governments. And so, this is where we kind of see a coming together of local power dynamics with this larger imperial German project. And this is also where it's hard to kind of untangle necessarily, right, where local driven or local initiated violence stops and where the German genocidal violence begins, right? This is what has often been hotly debated because again, previously Germans come in, maybe they shoot 200 or 300 people in a small town or 50 people. That would typically be seen as simply German violence. But now we know that sometimes Jews were tortured and killed before those killings by local populations, and then German troops come in and do the final killing. Or we know that locals were instrumental in organizing the killings themselves or aiding the Germans in the killings. And so this is where, depending on the location, it's really hard to kind of situate that violence into one category or another. And we should say in Tuchin, after the violence of July 6th, within weeks, we do see one of these mass shootings. So something, I believe, 40 to 50 people, I'm not going to remember off the top of my head, who are portrayed or seen as Jewish leadership in this town are shot by the Germans with the help of the local police force. So we can see that kind of, there's one way to understand this as kind of, escalatory violence where we see looting, we see sporadic violence, we see pogroms in some areas. We see more kind of semi-organized violence and shootings in the summer of 41. And then once we get to starting in late fall of 41, then especially into 42, then we're going to see the Holocaust by bullets. And this is where we're going to see just mass executions by hand, by bullets of the Einsatz group in towns throughout this region.
Since your work focuses on how ordinary individuals became perpetrators under rapidly changing conditions, and given the commonly cited dictum that those who don't study history are doomed to repeat it, what lessons does this history offer for understanding mass violence in other contexts?
Sure, thanks. So, I mean, I think one of the main lessons more generally about my work and about, I'd say, my own kind of takeaways from studying political violence for as long as I have is that ordinary people under the right circumstances can very typically do a lot of terrible things, right? And that the reasons for people doing terrible things is not necessarily because they're bad people. It's not necessarily because they've been put under the spell of ideology, either something they've inflicted upon themselves or because of their milieu or their community. That people can be brought into acts of violence and kind of politically charged and violent situations, oftentimes for factors that are not of their control, right, or not necessarily of their own volition, or even or even just general understanding ahead of time. And so it's important to keep this in mind that and why does that matter? So we understand that average people can participate in terrible things. That kind of shifts, I think, a broader responsibility in understanding and conceptualizing violence not as just something that evil people do who have ideology and carry out and force other people to do things, and that this is just a kind of safe and comfortable zone and distance from which we can look at, politically violent events, to understanding that there's a deep responsibility in making sure that oftentimes a small group of people, oftentimes with not a lot of power, are not given the opportunity and not put in a position where they're able to bring a lot of people who otherwise would not typically be violent, would not participate in these events. And even beyond that, it puts just a larger emphasis on the kind of larger responsibilities of restoring or kind of maintaining order and structure and preventing large scale events, because in large scale violent events like war and invasions, because when these ruptures happen, it is in these kind of spaces where local actors and other times people with nefarious goals are able to operate and are able to cause oftentimes a really just kind of unforeseen amount of damage and violence. And again, I think we should still, does not mean we need to condone or wash away local participation or average people's participation in terrible events. But I think it's kind of putting their participation in a larger view that I think is kind of helpful for animating how we might respond to future violent events or prevent them from happening.
After years of researching these events, is there a question that continues to trouble or challenge you the most?
Yeah, so I mean, I brought this up in the talk. I don't know if this was during the Q&A, and I think it was spurred by a really nice question from one of the students. Um, it's on one hand, and they've kind of had this experience when talking about, especially in this particular case, talking about one violent event on one evening in one town, and undertaking this kind of analytical journey to trying to determine who participated, who was victimized, what are all the details of the event, unpacking the biographies of victims and perpetrators and bystanders, situating this in longer term histories and trajectories and waves of violence in this region, right? Unpacking the political movements around this violence, unpacking the Nazi regime. And then when you return to the violence itself, and there's obviously, this is often most strongly felt through the testimonies of, victims and people who went through this violence. When you return to the violence itself, and you kind of take off this, take off this analytical lens, and you just look at and just try to take in what occurred on this particular night, which this happened thousands of times across this region during this time period, but just focus on one night on neighbors committing, just absolutely brutal acts of violence against their neighbors. There's something that just feels unsatisfying. I mean, this is kind of undercutting all my work and purpose, but there's something unsatisfying about even achieving my wildest dreams analytically of trying to get at the kind of deeper questions of participation and perpetration and contextualization of violence. That when you look at the act of violence that took place in this one home, in this one pogrom, and this is in the house of Laura Oberlander, with which I start the talk. There's something that feels deeply unsatisfying about almost all of the research and all of the work, and even if I had even greater access to the historical data that I'd want, it really feels unsatisfying to understand how you could walk into someone's home and beat a mother over the head with a spiked bat, and then a 7-year-old girl, and then kill an infant, completely unprovoked in this particular instance, right? And against presumably someone who you've lived with for decades. There's something just deeply unsettling about that. So, is that a question that I can't answer, or something something to be framed in those ways? Perhaps, or perhaps this is just this uncomfortable space between kind of achieving what you want to do in a scholarly dimension with this the reality of these events, and maybe that space will always exist for people who work on these themes.